I would definitely qualitatively say that Angola is really quite a different political system and government than it was even just 10, 15 years ago.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Joe Biden's final foreign trip as president was a long-promised visit to sub-Saharan Africa, Angola to be precise. Biden long promised to be the first president to visit Africa in nearly a decade, but the trip was delayed and only comes with just weeks left in office. Still, the trip was intended to solidify at least one part of the Biden administration's legacy, a major infrastructure project called the Lobito Corridor. This is a rail line linking mineral-rich parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo to a port on Angola's Atlantic coast. A key question now is whether or not this legacy will survive the incoming Trump administration. And more broadly, how might the Trump administration's approach to Africa differ, if at all, from the outgoing Biden administration? Joining me to answer these questions and many more is Ziyanda Stuurman, Senior Analyst for Africa at the Eurasia Group. We kick off discussing why Angola is well suited for a major American investment like the Lobito Corridor, and then have a wide-ranging conversation about how this investment fits into geopolitical competition between China and the United States. Finally, we discuss what might or might not change about U.S. policy towards Africa with a change in administration. This episode is part of our ongoing efforts to showcase African voices in peace and security issues on the continent, something I think is vital to do. If you want to support our work to that end, please visit globaldispatches.org and get a paying subscription. You'll get a host of benefits, not least of which is knowing that you are helping to keep this long-running independent show alive. And honestly, we can't do it without you. Each individual subscription goes a long way. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Ziyanda Stuurman of the Eurasia Group. Thanks so much for joining me. So I just wanted to kick off by asking you, why Angola? There are 49 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, I guess, depending on how you count. Why did Joe Biden pick Angola for his first and only trip to the region?
President João Lourenço now has been, I think, very intentional about broadening, Angola's foreign relationships and diplomatic ties, and very much doing so in a way that, can bring in investment from the EU, from European governments, as well as companies, and really looking westwards in a way that his predecessor, former president of Angola, Dos Santos, hadn't done before. In Lourenço's first term, from 2017 onwards, 2017 to 2022, he undertook a huge amount of international trips and really put a lot of effort into positioning Angola as an investment-friendly destination and one that was more open to the world and open for business in many ways. And that's really, I think, accelerated in his second term, particularly with the flagship Lobito project.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that you describe this effort by President Lourenço as just so deeply intentional, presumably trying to kind of wash off the stain of corruption from the previous president, Dos Santos, who served for many, many years and was famously and notoriously corrupt and kleptocratic in many ways.
Lourenço has expended a huge amount of political capital within Angola and across the MPLA his political party, as you say, really cast off the shadow of the DeSantis era, the DeSantis family, and all of their acolytes. I think in his second term in office has been difficult sometimes to move forward with the deepest reforms and the deepest anti-corruption campaigns and measures across government. But I would definitely qualitatively say that Angola is really quite a different political system and government than it was even just 10, 15 years ago.
So if this trip by Biden is the consequence and the result of really like an intentional campaign of like wooing the West and wooing the United States by President Lorenzo, how did Biden's itinerary on this trip reflect that?
If we step back for a second and think about the past 18 months, I think particularly if we're looking at the Sahel region with a number of countries that are now under the leadership of military juntas, some of them being former close US allies or at least partners in security and military operations.
And just to stop you, you're referring to Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali specifically.
That's right, exactly. So, given the sharp anti-Western, anti-French, anti-US sentiment in that part of the world, the Biden administration has had to think about where else it can either deepen relationships or forge new ones. And Angola makes a ton of sense, if you're thinking through that lens. And then I think on top of that, layering today meetings with the presidents of Zambia as well as the Democratic Republic of Congo and the vice president of Tanzania, you do really sort of understand just how important the Lobito project is in bringing, number one, all of those countries together, and again, deepening and forging new partnerships. And I think also importantly, having a very key strategic aim for the US in terms of access to critical minerals and really being able to corner the market in a way in terms of finding really smart and new routes for the export of those minerals in a way that really rivals what China has been able to do in the past decade.
So presumably that includes the Lobito Corridor, which you've mentioned a few times. Can you just explain to listeners who are unfamiliar, what is the Lobito Corridor and why is it imbued with such significance?
This is a freight rail corridor that runs from mining operations in Zambia through the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there are also mining operations there, and then goes out to the port city of Lobito in sort of central southern Angola. What this 1,200 kilometers of rail, you'll have to excuse me, I don't know what the conversion of that is to miles.
It's really big.
Exactly, it's long. It's big.
I think that is the technical term. But really, if you just look at a map and try to connect Zambia to Angola, you are talking about a massive distance.
Exactly. And all along the way of this corridor are special economic zones that have been set up, not just for the extraction of some of these critical minerals I was talking about earlier, copper from Zambia, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, lithium from Angola and elsewhere. You're also talking about new industries that are being created in and around the corridor that these three governments really hope can add to the beneficiation of these raw materials, and not just exporting raw materials, but actually being able to process and add value to those materials before they're exported to some European countries. But I think primarily for the US, their interest is being able to ship some of these materials and goods from Lobito to the east coast of the US. And there likely is in the future, I think, to be some interest as well in being able to broaden the scope of these projects to also facilitate exports to the Far East.
And it's worth emphasizing that the minerals you referenced are those essential components of like the green energy revolution of batteries and solar panels and all the like.
Exactly. And, electrical vehicle manufacturing and many other industries, those industries don't exist on the African continent at scale, at least. And really the idea that this is mutually beneficial is definitely one that's been played up by Lorenzo in Angola and Biden, of course, from the US perspective. And truly the idea is to elevate many of these mined goods and materials so that, again, they're not just leaving the continent in their raw form, but that this larger, huge industrial project allows for the creation of manufacturing industries and other new technology industries in Africa itself.
And it's worth, I think, noting from an American perspective that, the United States investment here is precisely that, an investment. It's not like a grant or some sort of concessional loan, right?
Correct, exactly. It's a very much a business deal between the governments of the three African countries I've mentioned, the US and the EU, and three large shipping and logistics companies that have come in to essentially commercially operate the rail corridor itself, but also to spur investment in a number of sectors connected to this project.
And where does this project stand now in terms of how complete or incomplete it is? And do they have like a estimated completion date?
I'll take a step back again and say that in previous years, in previous decades, some form of this larger rail corridor has existed before. There was the Benguela line in Angola itself, and that operated, for several years as Angola's former colonial power, Portugal, used to ship raw materials out from the country, and that existed from about the 1950s going into the 70s, and much of that line was destroyed during the Angolan Civil War. And so, part of the project is rehabilitating that broader railway line, adding to it, expanding, building other road and rail connections. And then you've got parts of this corridor that also already exist in the DRC and in Zambia, but either needed rehabilitation, better, sort of more efficient lines and methods to connect these different sort of pieces of the railway line. And then again, there are broader projects of special economic zones in all three countries. You're talking about a project that isn't kind of naturally all encompassing and coming together, but it is a bit of a patchwork and stitching together the best bits of infrastructure across all three countries. I would, at least by the standards and the timelines presented by both Biden and the three companies in charge of operating this new project, they've said that they would like to see, or at least project, between 1 million and 1.5 million tons of cargo moving across the line by 2030. We'll have to see how that goes. But I think that at this point is probably the most realistic timeline in terms of completion.
So 100% of the media coverage from American outlets that I've read on this trip frames this visit primarily in the context of American competition with China, not as like investing in Africa for its own sake. What do you make of that framing? It's something, as someone who covers Africa frequently, I find kind of infuriating, but it's telling in many ways.
Mm. I 100% agree with that, and share your frustration or aggravation as an Africa analyst myself, and obviously being African and living here, it can be really hard to break out of this U.S. versus China rivalry that really dominates so much of the coverage of projects like this or investments, similar investments that are made. But over and above, I think that framing, I think it is one that's true, but at the same time, I wouldn't completely or exclusively sort of put it into under that headline or under that banner. So much of this project is also about stimulating economic development in parts of Angola, I think especially, that have been underdeveloped or that have been overlooked in recent years. And much of that has to do with the fact that the Angolan economy is and has been so hyper focused on oil production. And much of that oil production is not necessarily onshore and certainly not in central and southern Angola. So this project is very, very important for the future of Angola's own economy. And I think very similarly, the future viability of the mining industry in the DRC and in Zambia. And I'll add one other perspective to this that I've written about, in my own work, which is about the regional competition that this has stimulated as well. You have countries like Namibia, South Africa, Mozambique, whose ports have been used for these types of exports before. And the Lobito project, particularly the port, really sort of signals to the governments of all three of those countries that there's a possibility for a much more efficient project that carries goods out to the US and to Europe. And so all of those three countries sort of feel like they've been put on notice to make their own port infrastructure and their own freight rail corridors either more efficient or become at least the preferred option for a number of these other companies that are on the continent and would like to move goods from the region elsewhere.
That's interesting. It sort of has this knock-on effect, a positive peer pressure sort of effect, you're saying.
Exactly. And ultimately, I think that's positive for both infrastructure development in all of those countries, as well as, again, rethinking industrial policy and stimulating investments in new industries that doesn't necessarily just rely on the positionality, again, of the three countries I mentioned, Namibia, South Africa, and Mozambique, but really sort of forces authorities there to think about the future of their own export economies.
So in my earlier question, I didn't mean to dismiss the idea that the Biden administration's focus on Angola and the Lobito Corridor is not inspired by competition with China. It certainly is. And so I do want to have you explain how you see the Lobito Corridor in the context of America's competition with China over resources in that part of sub-Saharan Africa.
I would agree that it is really an important factor, and one could easily argue that, but for that aspect of the sort of great power rivalry that's playing out at the moment, something like the Lobito Corridor maybe wouldn't have happened. So there is a great importance to timing and opportunity, and of course the geopolitical moment that we're in, all being in Angola's favor. I think that particularly the last few U.S. administrations have really been caught on the back foot by China's very ambitious infrastructure investments through its Belt and Road Initiative, particularly on the African continent, but also Southeast Asia as well as Latin America. And they've had to find a way, I think, especially in the past few years, to pivot and to think about their own relationships on the African continent and what it means to have, again, another great power rival come in and really sort of change the dynamic of the way that they do investments and that they forge diplomatic relationships. If you cast your mind back to late 2022 when Biden hosted the US Africa Summit in Washington, D.C., I think that was in December 2022, and statements that were made by Vice President Kamala Harris, both of them actually really saying that they're all in on Africa in terms of US investment and relationships. I think what was slow to flow from that were actual investments, actual, contract signs, actual spades hitting the ground and working on projects. And this is, I would say, by far the largest such project that's flowed from those statements of being all in on Africa and now actually becoming a reality.
Well, that's interesting because I was going to ask you, what you see Biden's Africa legacy to be. And from what I'm hearing from you, there were big promises, but a slow implementation process. And now we have a new administration coming into office in about a month and a half. Do you expect the implementation of those promises to no longer happen? Or how do you foresee the Trump administration approaching Biden's promises to Africa?
That's a really good question. It brings me back to an initiative that was launched under Donald Trump in his first administration, which was called Prosper Africa. And really the broader idea that, there could be private sector led engagement and investment on the African continent by the US and therefore supported by the US government. And so in this sense, the Lobito Corridor works perfectly in that framing and in that paradigm. The only problem with it, and I think that's the gist of what your question has raised, the only problem with it is that this is a signature Biden policy or piece of work. And we've seen when Trump in his first administration came into power, really tried to limit the idea of there being a legacy for former President Barack Obama. And I think that there's a very real fear that Trump and his administration may try to roll back the Lobito project, or at least the US's involvement in it, given the fact that it's so closely tied to Biden himself. I would at least hope that the advisors around Trump, and particularly the vision that they had under Prosper Africa, understand that this project could not be more aligned with that broader vision, and building on it is actually the best way for at least not necessarily just this project, but the broader shift in US relations with Africa, moving from, values promotion more towards a trade and investment angle, or at least outlook.
So I take your point that Trump seemingly out of pique, sought to reverse many of Obama's signature foreign policy moves, including the Iran nuclear deal and normalization with Cuba. But I do speculate here that because it's Africa and it kind of flies under the radar, it's not a top priority, and because potentially this has to do with competition with China, that maybe the Lobito Corridor might be safe.
I think that, Joao Lorenzo in Luanda hopes for the exact same thing. I think that there's a real realization here that U.S.-Africa policy doesn't really change massively from president to president, be they Democrats or Republicans. And I think the broader thinking really is around the fact that Africa will kind of drift into the background again, and that bureaucrats will move these sort of projects forward with or without, I think, a very explicit stamp of approval from Trump.
So if that is indeed the case, that the Lobito Corridor moves accordingly, what do you sort of predict Biden's legacy on Africa will be?
I think there was such an interesting shift and change, under Biden, particularly with the US-Africa summit in December 2022. It was several months after he was inaugurated and really got into the work that he did as president. But there was a sense of sort of palpable shift, or at least a move from, again, these smaller kind of bilateral relationships with individual countries on the continent to at least this idea for a bigger, bolder strategy that really sort of focused on Africa's future and not necessarily just where Africa is today, but where it was looking to move towards. Of course, this was highly, highly complicated by the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as well as between Israel and Hamas, in the last 2 to 3 years. And as I mentioned again, the slew of coups in the last 18 months in West Africa and the Sahel. It's been an uneven kind of journey, I think, from about 2022 to get to this point. But I certainly think that Biden will hope that once people look back and evaluate the impact that he made in terms of US-Africa policy, that it was, yes, a commitment that was slow to move, but once it did, it manifested in, a large industrial project that could very well become the backbone of a number of economies in Central and Southern Africa.
Is there anything else you want to mention or discuss?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would mention is just that there are, I think, still broader plans around, a second phase of the Lobito Corridor that would rope in Tanzania. But I think that's complicated by the fact that the governments of Tanzania and Zambia signed an agreement with the Chinese government to rehabilitate what's called the Tazara Railway. And that would link some mines in Zambia to the port of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And if that worked, then it would mean the Lobito Corridor would quite literally traverse East Africa to West Africa and, plays into our broader understanding of the US-China rivalry in this sense. But, this works perfectly for a country like Zambia that gets the benefit of being, positioned well in terms of its American and Chinese relationships.
And geographically, in that, it's basically equidistant between Lobito and Dar es Salaam, sitting directly smack in the middle of the continent. So it could play both sides, and incidentally, is a huge copper exporting country.
Precisely. And also, has connections to ports in South Africa. So Zambia is doing well for itself.
All right, this might be Zambia century.
There we go. There we go.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.